Record now. There we go. It tells us what it's going to do. All right, if you did not get a syllabus, please let me know or let Dave know. We will make sure that you get one. I know some people don't make a determination that they're going to take a class sometimes until the very evening of the class. That's not a problem, but I want to make sure that you get the syllabus because it contains a lot of information that you're going to need to know, especially if you're taking this for credit. If you're taking it for audit, you can drop in and out. All of these we're recording them, so we'll have access to them later on, but we want to make sure that you know what's happening with the class. We'll get into that in just a couple of seconds. So let's go through it. If you would, take out your syllabus. Let's go through this for just a short period, and then we'll get into some material from the class. All right. So up at the top, of course, this is a weighted 3-credit hour class. So it applies to your permanent record. If you're taking it for credit, it will apply to any of our 4 certificates. If you're trying to attain one of those as an elective, okay? So remember that 3 credit hours. We will be going from tonight, which is August 9th, all the way through November 15th of this year. And we will always be in person here at the campus in Warner Robins, unless you're told otherwise. And I'll get to that here in a second, because there will be at least one occasion where that will be the case. But if you decide that, hey, I want to get out one night, I want to come and sit with the class, we'd be more than happy to have you here as it was one more person. So let's look at this course description. This course examines the historical and geographic context of the Old Testament books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Emphasis will be placed on the political and cultural impacts of the division of Israel into 2 separate nations, as well as the effects of the northern kingdom's official adoption of idolatry in place of proper worship. This will be a major portion of our study, is what happens when the children of God decide that they're not going to worship acceptably. And this is going to be something that you're going to be able to talk to other people about. Is why is worship important? Why is proper worship important? Well, we're going to talk about that. Is there a proper way of worshiping? Well, we find so here, and I would imagine that we're going to find the same thing even in the New Testament. All right. Consideration will also be given to the effect of successive generations of unrighteous rulership. This didn't happen in a vacuum. Improper leadership began early on, and the negative effects of that never let up in either the northern or the southern kingdom. There are problems in both kingdoms. Northern, of course, more than any, but the southern kingdom as well. And the influences of foreign domination by heathen kingdoms and empires. And of course, we can go back to what God told the children of Israel when they first went into the land of Canaan. What were they to do? They were to eliminate the heathen nations that dwelt there. They didn't. It was a big mistake because that came back to bite them a little bit later on. The long-lasting impact of these influences, as well as their implications for Israel/Judah's continued relationship with God, will also be considered, as will messianic imagery and typology in these books. So that's just a brief overview, a brief course description. I'm your instructor, Chuck Scarborough. This is my email right next to it, chuck.gsop1@gmail.com. I thought about putting my phone number. I will tell you now, if you call me, I get probably 30 to 40 messages a day. And I'm afraid that if you try to call me on the phone or send me a text, it's going to get knocked all the way to the bottom because of everything else. Please, if you got to get in touch with me, go to my email. I check my email on the regular. I mean, probably every 30 to 45 minutes, I check my email. That is the best way to get with me. So that's what I put down for communication. All right. Books. I was asked a couple of times what books I was going to be using. And at the end of the day, the books that I'm going to be using are going to be, of course, in just a second, let me pull this back up again. There are no required textbooks for this course. I'm going to be using several different texts. I have an emphasis, however, on some study guides that I've used in the past. These are 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and they were authored by Irving Jensen. They're available from Moody Press. I got them on Amazon. They are very inexpensive, but they are a very good study guide. There are more scholarly works out there, and we're going to talk about that here. Crockett, A Harmony of the Books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. This is an excellent book. We were talking about that before class began. It really goes into how these kingdoms dealt with one another, and it goes back and forth, and it explains this is what's happening in Judah, this is what's happening in Israel, and how they correspond to each other, and then how they interact with one another. I highly recommend that you get this book if you want to have a really good library later on, especially if you're going for your biblical certification or your preaching certificate. You need a good library. This would be a very good one to have. But we're going to be using mainly study guides, and I'm going to be bringing in things from other works. Also, the Kaufman commentaries, and you can actually view those online at studylight.org. I have com there. I'm sorry, studylight.org. They are all online, so you can pull those up and you can go through. And I usually have two computers going at one time. I can look at Kings, and I can switch over here and look at Chronicles, and I can kind of view those at the same time. So that's what I recommend. All right. Course assignments and requirements. This is the grading summary. Class participation and attendance. I kind of feel kind of strange about even putting that in here. I'm going to take your word that you're in attendance because I have no way of determining whether you're in attendance. I trust that you'll do the right thing. If you're taking it for audit, it doesn't matter. You can dip in and out as you wish. But if you're taking it for credit, I'm going to take your word for it that you were in class. All right. But that's 20% of the final grade, not a large percentage anyway. And again, we're going to be gentlemen and scholars, gentle ladies and gentlemen and scholars. So we're going to go on the honor system. Research paper is 20% of the final grade, and we'll get to those research papers here in just a moment. Midterm examination, 30%, and final examination, 30% of your final grade. Both exams are going to be take-home tests based on the material that's presented in class. I'm not going to throw you a curveball. In fact, I'm going to give you some opportunities to gain extra credit on the test if you want. If you go to First Chronicles, there's several different genealogies. I'm going to ask you to do nine people in, but I'll let you know which one of those I want. You will need to read the text. You will need to attend class, be in class, and study your notes to pass the exams. You won't be able to go back and cram for these. So please make sure that you watch these classes. Exams are to be proctored. You're not by yourself. The old saying, trust but verify. So if you're going to take a test, we ask that you find someone, a neutral third party, maybe the church secretary or your preacher, or one of your elders, have them proctor the test, and then you're going to sign it and you're going to return it to me. All right. And you're going to put their name and information so that we can reach out to them if there's any problems or considerations. All right. Research paper. Research paper is required for credit in this class. 10 pages, including a bibliography, is the minimum length for this paper. Proper form for the research paper includes a title page, table of contents, footnotes, bibliography. A minimum of 5 separate sources should be included in the bibliography. The research paper will be due on November 29th, so that's 2 weeks after the final class. And I'm going to tell you this, I am going to do everything in my power to return papers and tests to you in a timely fashion. It sometimes can get difficult, but I want to make sure that if you give me a test within a week, I want to have that test back to you with your grade on there so you know what's happening. All right. Selection of a topic must be turned in by August 30th. So be thinking now, if you're going to have to write a paper, be thinking about your paper. I've already had one gentleman. He should be with us here tonight. I'm not going to call him out because if he's not here, then I'm going to embarrass him. But he's already reached out to me about what kind of papers am I going to ask for. So here, with that in mind, let's look at this. Students may choose from the following topics: the reformative efforts of King Josiah mirrored in the Restoration Movement, idolatrous practices instituted in the Northern Kingdom and their contribution to the desolation of Israel, the consistency of God's love in the face of the divided kingdom. And if none of those three appeal to you, if you reach out to me with an idea that you might have, I'll give it consideration. And if it sounds like it would be a good paper and I think that you can get enough out of it, don't pick something that you might be able to get 2 or 3 pages from, because that's not going to work. You need something that's going to have some meat to it, some weight to it, that you can develop a full-fledged paper. But reach out to me if you have an idea. I'll give it every consideration. And if it sounds good, then I'll give it the okay. And that's what we'll go with. And bonus, if I teach this class again, I might look at your paper and use that as one of the topics for research papers next time. All right, let's look at our weekly schedule. Weekly schedule. I'm not going to go into every single aspect of this, but if you look this August 9th and August 16th, which is next week, we will be in class. On August 23rd, the class will be recorded and posted for viewing. I will record that, and then we'll make that available. We'll figure out, I know we got some good tech guys. They'll be able to figure out how to make that available. I will be polishing the pulpit, and I will not be able to do a live class. So I'll have that pre-recorded, and we may even make it available a little early so that you can do it even before Tuesday, but that'll be the case. So tonight we're going to do our course introduction, review of syllabus. We're going to look at a couple of things, some introduction to the history and geography. Next week, we're going to look at the last days of David and Solomon being crowned. August 23rd, the early days of Solomon, the construction of the temple. August 30th, the dedication of the temple and the prosperity of Solomon. And there's some surprises with the prosperity of Solomon. It's an interesting study. As we said earlier, August 30th assignment, your assignment for that is the research paper topic selection is due. You don't have to have your paper, but you need to let me know if you're taking it for credit, what your paper is going to be on. So you need to make sure you send that to me. September 6th, the apostasy of Solomon, the divided kingdom. September 13th, Ahab, Jezebel, and Elijah, and the alliances between not only Judah and Israel, but between these different countries and the heathen nations that were surrounding them. September 20th, the men of God versus the enemies of God. That's, of course, the prophets versus the evil kings that they were prophesying against. September 27th, the beginning of the end. Remember, the northern kingdom was carried away much earlier, but Judah was not far behind. So we're going to talk about that. October 4th, Israel right before its captivity, and Judah is in trouble at this point. This is our midterm review, and I will send the exam out. The exam will be due back by October 11th, so keep that in mind. I may move that up. It depends. I've got 9 class periods in the midterm and then only 6 in the second part, but I will let you know in plenty of time. This won't be something that I'll do and just throw it out there. All right, October 11th, Israel taken captive, the great carrying away. October 18th, the righteousness of Hezekiah. October 25th, Manasseh, the repentant apostate. November 1st, Josiah, the reformer. November 8th, Josiah to captivity. And November 15th, there will be a couple of class periods where we might do a little catch up, get some stuff covered that we weren't able to get covered. And that'll be our last class is November 15th. Now, having said that, this is the calendar that we have. If you know anything about any kind of upper level class, the calendar is a suggestion. It's not a rule. If you look down and say, well, he didn't get done everything he said he was going to get done, we will. I promise you, we're going to get done everything that we need to get done in order to cover this class in its entirety. But it may not follow exactly according to the calendar that we have here. This is more of a suggestion, kind of give you an idea about where we are and what we're trying to get accomplished. All right, GSOP grading policies. If you're taking it for credit, the steering committee and the school have determined that this is their grading schedule, the grading policy. A is 90 to 100, B 80 to 89, C 70 to 79, D 60 to 69, F 59 or below. I'm sure we're not going to have anybody in that basically the right hand column. We're not going to have anybody in that. I want to make sure that I'm not here to see if I can flunk people. I want people to succeed. I want people to pass this class if you're taking it for credit. All right. We don't need to necessarily go into the GSOP school policy on the next page. It basically is something we put into all of them so people know our stance and our viewpoint as far as the school is concerned. We accept everyone. We don't turn anyone away with certain exceptions for that. Tuition and textbooks, there's no cost for tuition, no cost for admission, but you do have to pay for your own books. So I would go ahead and start looking at the books that I made you aware of just a couple moments ago. And let's see, this one on the tail end of this is ethics. All right, I want to make sure that everybody understands this. Students attending the Georgia School of Preaching and Biblical Studies will be expected without exception to adhere to the highest standards of honesty, integrity, and Christian principles. No instances of plagiarism, cheating, or other misconduct about academics, class conduct, or any other facet of student life will be tolerated. All classwork, course assignments, and examinations, as well as all other academic requirements, will be fulfilled by the student who registers for the course. Potential disciplinary cases in such matters will be handled by the course instructor with the oversight and full approval of the campus director, as well as the office of the GSOP director. That's me. So I've got two of those right here. I'm the course instructor and I'm the GSOP director. So please do your own work, do it to the best of your ability. There's no disgrace in an honest C, but there's every bit of disgrace in a dishonest A. Any test, assignment, or other related coursework that is deemed to have been plagiarized or otherwise fraudulently completed will receive a failing grade of F. Further disciplinary action will come at the discretion of the course instructor, campus director, and the office of the GSOP director. All right, and that is our syllabus. And I don't know, we don't have any no questions so far. Nobody's asked anything. Okay, excellent. All right. All right, we've got one more person in there with us tonight. Excellent. So we got three out of everybody that's signed up. But that's okay. I'm glad to see it. All right, so let's get into this just a little bit this evening, folks. Let's go ahead and get it out. If you're taking notes, now is when you want to start taking notes. So let's look at this for just a couple moments. There's some history that you have to go into. Now, one thing that we're not going to do in this class is start arguing about dates. Listen, this has been gone over for years and years and years and years. And every single time it seems that there's a general consensus, there will be a new group of scholars that will come out and say, well, we think this and we think this and we think this. This is not what we need to do in this class, is get bogged down in specific dates. Remember that the Israelites view time in a different way than we view time. So we don't want to get bogged down in that, but we are going to throw some dates out as a part of the class so that we can understand a little bit better. There's some things that we can know for certain, but there's some others that we're just not, we're putting our best foot forward, we're taking our best guess, and we're going with that. We do know this, that the words that we're going to study are divinely inspired. They came from God, and we know that we can trust them no matter what direction it takes us. We can trust them to be the truth. Okay. All right. So with this in mind, let's look at this, a little textual history. And if you want to write this down, now would be a good time. In the Hebrew Bible, the Bible used by the Israelites and the Jews, 1st and 2nd Kings are two books or one book. They're one book. 1st and 2nd Kings are a single book, as are the 1st and 2nd books of Samuel. But when this was translated, when these were translated into Greek in the last few centuries BC, Samuel was actually joined with Kings in a 4-part work called the Book of Kingdoms. But when I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses, and I'm having to, let me enlarge this just a little bit. All right. When a Latin translation, of course, known as the Vulgate, was made for the Western Church, Kingdoms was first retitled the Book of Kings, parts 1 to 4, and eventually both Samuel and Kings were separated into 2 books each. So we have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and then, of course, 1st and 2nd Chronicles later on. Can anybody tell me, if you have an idea, if you have a guess, who was according to Jewish tradition, who was the author of Kings? Let me know if anybody says anything. According to tradition, Jeremiah penned the Book of Kings. Now, he would have been alive during the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. The most common view today is that Kings concludes a unified series of books that reflect the language and theology of the book of Deuteronomy. And scholars today tend to treat it as made up of at least 2 layers. A first edition from the time of Josiah, which is the late 7th century BC. And what this did was this promoted Josiah's religious reforms. That was what he was well known for, was his religious reforms and the need for repentance. And then there was a second and final edition from about the mid-6th century BC. All right. Now, here's something, and this is something you will need to know. The major themes. Number one, the promise. Number two, apostasy. And number three, judgment. Major themes for the book of Kings. We have the promise. Which promise? It's God's promise, right? It was God's promise to his people. In return for Israel's promise to worship Jehovah alone, Jehovah makes promises to David and to Israel. To David, of course, the promise that his line would rule Israel forever. Now, the question is, how is this correct? How does David's line still rule Israel forever? Now, here's where a lot of people start to veer off into millennialism and the idea that there will be a second coming of the nation of Israel, that Christ will come and he will again anoint Israel in its present condition to be the religious leader of the world and the physical leader of this world. He will sit on the throne in Jerusalem. And of course, we know, and we're going to see that here through our study, that that's absolutely incorrect. But we do know this: David's throne still rules Israel, doesn't it? How do we know this?
Yes, it does. Because Jesus.
Absolutely. That's right. Because Jesus came from whose line? The line of David, right?
David.
And he still sits on the throne. But what throne is that? Is that a physical throne in Israel? Absolutely not.
His throne is in heaven beside God.
His throne is in heaven. And who is Israel today? It's us, right? We are the church of Jesus Christ, is the spiritual Israel. So yes, David's the line of David still sits on the throne, but it is not a physical throne. It is not a physically located in this world. It is the church all over the world. He sits on the throne and he rules over his spiritual Israel, which, by the way, is far greater. I'm sorry if I look this direction, it's because that's where I heard the sound come from. So I'm looking at the television set, but that's absolutely correct. So it is correct, but not in the sense that those in the denominational world want it to be. It's incredible to me. Every time I start to talk to people, I realize how many people still believe that God has not fulfilled his promise, that God is slack concerning his promise. But we know that the scriptures tell us that God is what? Not slack concerning his promise. He is faithful. When he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. And he does it when he says he's going to do it. He does not put it off or forget about it. And that's even a secondary thing that I've found is when I talk to people, they say, well, God has kind of forgotten. God hasn't forgotten anything. God says, I'm going to do that. And he does it when he says he's going to do it in the manner that he says he's going to do it. All right. God has never taken half measures. And in fact, that's cost mankind a lot, hasn't it? I mean, you think about it. When God destroyed the world with water, did he destroy a portion of the world? Every single living person under heaven died except for 8, and only the 8 that were saved through the ark, not by any machination of their own. God does not engage in half measures. It's absolutely correct. All right. So in return for Israel's promise, Jehovah makes promise to David. He says, your line will always sit on the throne of Israel. And to Israel, the nation, this new nation, he makes a promise that the land that they will possess, he gives them the land. He says, I will give it to you, and it will be a possession to you, and you will be a possession to me. He gives it to them, and they inhabit it. And in fact, the scripture very, very plainly, specifically says that God did everything that he said he was going to do. So it kind of takes the idea that God does not fulfill his promises off the table, or that there's a promise yet to fulfill, a land promise yet to fulfill. It's just not there. All right. So the next thing is the apostasy. All right. We're talking about 3 major themes now. Number 1 is the promise. We find that at the very beginning. Now that promise goes back even farther than that, but this is the promise that God makes to David and to Israel. All right. But now we have the idea of the apostasy. What is apostasy? What does it mean? What does the word mean? Paraphrasing it. Apostasy means what? Exactly.
It's falling away.
Falling away. I'm sorry. If I need to stay in one place, I can. I'll try. All right. It means a falling away. All right. But we know that man has never fallen away from God, right? He's never done that. God's always, or mankind has always been faithful to God no matter what. Of course not. Listen, the reason that the world was destroyed by the flood was because of man's falling away. The reason that God made this promise to Abraham that he was going to make of him a great nation and there was going to be a place that he was going to bring his people. What did he have to do? He had to drive out the nations that were already inhabiting that land. Why did he do that? Because they'd fallen away. They were repugnant. They were a stench in his nostrils. And he tells them, he said, if you're not better than them, then I'm going to drive you out of this land. That land was sacred. It was holy. He says, if you can't do any better than the people, I will drive you out like I drove out the nations before you. All right. So God is very specific.
Israel had a short attention span. God taught them lesson
Yes.
after lesson after lesson, gave them chance after chance after chance. But yet, again, they would go apostatize over and over.
It's interesting when we talk about that they had a very short attention span. It's absolutely true that they could not maintain their integrity. But it also gives us a very specific lesson for us today. There are so many parallels between the books of Kings and Chronicles and even the Lord's church today. If we do not behave, if we do not worship him acceptably, if we don't do what he says, then he will take. What did he do with the 7 churches of Asia? What happened to them? He said, if you don't, I will come and I will do what? I will take away your lampstand. For the individual Christian, when we stand before God, if we have not done as we are told to do, what is going to happen to us? He will drive us from his presence, and we will not stand before. We will not live with him for an eternity. We must continue to engage in God's word and learn. And one of the biggest problems was that they did not engage in the word. That was one of the big issues. The Levites were not instructing them. The kings were not being the best example. And the people had their own portion of that, their own guilt to bear in that. But if we look at these, the books of Kings and Chronicles are looking at the heads of state and their influence and what their portion of this was. Because remember, who wanted kings? Did God want the people to have a king? He did. But who was supposed to be their king? God was supposed to be their king. But they said, no, we want a king like who? The nations. We want a king like the nations. See, right off the bat, we've got a problem. They already want to be like the people that they drove out of the land. And it was not, God didn't want it. He didn't like it one bit, but he says, I'm going to give them what they want. And you're going to warn them. And they warn them. And what did the people say? Oh, no, never, Lord. We would never do that. We will continue to serve you faithfully. And what happened? It was not very long before they fell into apostasy. So this great tragedy, this historical tragedy of Israel's history, this destruction, it led to eventually the destruction of both kingdoms and then the temple. All right, is due to the failure of the people, but especially the kings, to worship God, Jehovah alone. Jehovah being, of course, the God of Israel. All right. Then the last week, of course, we have judgment. What apostasy? Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
Becky says, how are Christians now spiritual Israel?
Well, what happens? How are we spiritual Israel? Not in the physical sense, and we have to be very careful. What was Israel? What was Israel? Israel was who? God's people. Is the church God's kingdom? Yes, the church is God's kingdom. That's why it's a spiritual Israel, not a physical Israel. We have no land, sacred land to call our own as the physical Israel did. But we are what? A chosen people. We are a royal priesthood. Who does that sound like? We are a spiritual Israel. I don't want to get too hung up on that idea of the spiritual Israel, but we mirror Israel in almost every way. Think about it. You think about the way he brought Israel. What happened? He called, he brought them up, he delivered them. And then he gave them what? Law. He says, this is what you're to do. In that way, we are God's spiritual Israel. Again, I don't want to get too hung up on that idea and make some sort of a stand that may be odorous to other people, but that is what we are. God's chosen people, as Israel was God's chosen people.
Hey, Chuck,
All right. Yeah.
you think about it, the Old Testament times, the temple was only for the Jews. And Paul
Correct.
tells the church at Corinth that we are the temple of God. I mean,
Yes, we are.
and he's not talking to the heathen world there. He's talking to the church in Corinth. So there's another correlation between the two.
Well, absolutely correct. And if you go to the book of Hebrews, what was the book of Hebrews? Why was it written? What was it for? Who was that directed towards? The book of Hebrews specifically.
The Jewish people that had come out of Judaism that are going back into Judaism.
Exactly. They had come out of Judaism. They'd become New Testament Christians. And now that lure, that siren song and I think it's mainly the social aspect and the worship aspect. I'm not going to lie. I as I'm reading Kings and Chronicles, I can see the allure of that worship process of the Jews. The mechanical aspect of it and the ritualistic aspect of it. And it is very alluring. That's why a lot of people convert to denominations that engage in that kind of behavior. They like the idea of the lighting of the candles. They like the idea of the recitation of prayers and psalms in a mechanical fashion. I don't have to really think about it. I just say these words. And it's comforting. And a lot of people, that's what appeals to them about it. And I can completely understand why somebody might want to do that. So this is what's happening. They were chafing under this. They were chafing under freedom. Now they have the freedom in Christ, but they want to go back. And he's saying, don't go back. And the reason I asked that question about Hebrews is, if you look at the book of Hebrews, you look and you see the parallels of all of the things that the trappings of Judaism, how they are mirrored in Christianity, except that under Judaism, there is no salvation. That was the problem. You're not going to get salvation through Christ's blood in Judaism. What was the sacrifice in Judaism? Whatever you got, right? A bull, a goat, a pigeon, whatever you might have. What is the sacrifice under Christianity? It's the blood of Jesus Christ. Perfect lamb. But if you look at it, there's a temple in Judaism, right? There's a temple in Christianity. There's a high priest in Judaism, and there's a high priest in Christianity. There's a sacrifice in Judaism, but there's sacrifice in Christianity. However, all of these things, all of these types in Hebrews that he's talking about, all of these types are found in the superior fashion in Christianity. Yes, there was a temple in Judaism, but what happened to the temple? How many times was it destroyed? Every time somebody came through, and in the not too distant future, it was going to be destroyed and never rebuilt.
And they made fun of Christ when he said it would.
I'm going to raise it up again in 3 days. What about the high priest? He says, we have a high priest, but he's not like the high priest. We read about some of the high priests under Judaism. Were they always faithful? Were they always even godly men? No. But what kind of high priest do we have today? Perfect. He was tempted as all men are tempted, yet he never sinned.
Yeah, without sin.
Never sinned. Okay, so that's why that idea that we are the spiritual, it's not the physical Israel, we are the spiritual Israel even today. We have all the promises, but they're fulfilled in a superior fashion. All right. So anyway, we got judgment. So we've got promise, we've got apostasy, and then we've got judgment. Apostasy always leads to judgment. Always. It doesn't always lead to destruction, but it always leads to judgment. Now we're going to see that in both the unified kingdom and then the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom would go into apostasy after David and Solomon. They weren't always destroyed, but God always brought them. He corrected them. All right. He chastised them. And sometimes okay, I want to make sure we're got the right time. Always with the idea of doing what? It wasn't to destroy. It didn't want to destroy him. What was the chastising? What was the discipline for the purpose of? To bring them back. To bring them back. Remember how it reminds me a lot of what they said in the as they're coming up out of Egypt. He says, "Why would you bring these people to this desolate land and then destroy them here? What would your enemies say?" And I think it's the same way in as far as the nations are concerned, the kingdoms are concerned. Think about it. Why would God set them up and do all that he's done only to abandon them the first time that they make a huge mistake? He didn't do that in the wilderness. He chastised them, but he brought them back several times. So he's going to do the same thing with the kingdoms. They're going to go into apostasy. He's going to bring them back by chastising them. And they're going to go into apostasy again. He's going to bring them back. So apostasy leads to judgment. Judgment is not really so much punishment, but it's the natural, or I should say God ordained consequence of Israel's failure to worship Jehovah alone. What was the major concern? What was the final straw that sent God, that caused God to allow first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians to take away the kingdoms? What was the problem? The biggest problem, I don't want to say the worst sin, but it's the most predominant sin. It was what? It was idolatry. It was idolatry. That was the problem. Because remember, he says, if you'll worship me, if you will be my people, I will be your what? God. Well, what does God deserve? He deserves worship. The problem was that the kingdoms were not worshiping him acceptably. Now, having said that, that failure to worship God encompasses a lot of different problems. There are a lot of ways in which they did not worship him correctly. But the problem was they had put other gods before him. Some of them were the pagan gods that surrounded them. Some of them, it was a cult of personality. They desired the worship for themselves. Yes, ma'am.
Idolatry does not necessarily have to reflect a physical image.
Absolutely not.
Idolatry is anything that gets between us and God.
And I think that's an important distinction to make, don't you? Idolatry, even today, I dare say that not too many of us drive down the road and see some great statue of some creature that where you have a pantheon, a great group of people bowing down to this false god. Now, having said that, just a couple of minutes ago, we were talking, and while I was in Hawaii, it's been, let's see, 2005 or 2006. My family, we went to the Big Island. And while we were there, we went up to one of the big volcanoes. And it's an active volcano. You can look down there and you see all the stuff going on. It wasn't shooting anything out, but you could tell it wouldn't take much for this thing to erupt. And as we're walking up, I was struck. I'd never seen this before. In all the places that I've been, I'd never seen this. Sitting next to the rim of that volcano, I saw multiple cases of people leaving offerings to the volcano god, Pele. Plates of food, bottles of liquor, flowers, pictures, and those were left as shrines. Now that's what we think of when we think of idolatry. We think it's an image, it's a statue, it's a picture, it's something to stir up emotion on behalf of an animal, a being, a creature, the stars of the universe, whatever it might be. That's not the be all end all of the definition of idolatry. Idolatry is anything that takes the place of God that we put before God. And it's not even a matter of, and we got to be very careful, because this is what the Israelites did at first. First, they had God, and God was the object of their affections. It was the object of their love and the object of their worship. But then what they did was they started bringing in other gods, but they made it very clear. No, we're not replacing God with these gods, but we're going to worship them separately. They were separate but equal. All right, we're going to co-worship. And then pretty soon they brought these gods up and they became equal with God. And then before too long, God takes a back seat where the other gods are put in front. And then pretty soon God slips off the table altogether. That's how idolatry works. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's anything that takes our focus and our attention off of God, that we dedicate ourselves to it, then it's idolatry. And that's something that we need to constantly be looking at ourselves. And we look around the world and we see what people worship. You go to places where if you go to, and I don't recommend this, but if you go to North Korea, there are statues of their dictators. And those people are worshiped in the literal sense of the word. Everything flows from the beneficence of the great leader. And it's been that way in many places throughout the world, throughout history. The leader is the fount of all blessings, and they worship him in every way that you can imagine that you can worship. But the big problem that especially the northern kingdom, but even the southern kingdom at times had, was idolatry, and that was the final straw for God. I've lifted you up, and you continue to go away. I've lifted you up, and you continue to drift away. Now I'm going to chastise you in a way that you cannot ignore. You've ignored my prophets. Now I'm going to chastise you in a way that you cannot ignore. So what did he allow? He allowed the hated kingdoms of the east, and they were allowed to come in. They were allowed to destroy. They were allowed to pillage. They were allowed to carry away. One was carried away and was never seen again. The northern kingdom, Israel, was carried away, and it never regained any kind of significance. The southern kingdom, Judah, that remained at least somewhat faithful some of the time, was carried away, but it was allowed to return. But God said, you're not going to mistake this for anything else. I'm going to warn you about it, then I'm going to let it happen. And then it's going to be up to you. What are you going to do? Now, we'll say this. It's something we need to remember, that when Judah came back from captivity, pretty much idolatry had been stamped out. They realized their lesson. That was never really a problem for them ever again. They had their problems, but idolatry was not really one of them. They didn't even bring back the idols from Persia. When Cyrus allowed them to come back, they didn't even bring those back, because they realized that God was serious. Finally realized that God was serious when he says, you shall have no other gods before me. You'd think they would have understood that several thousand years before, when he first told them, hey, don't make idols, don't make graven image, don't worship anything before me. They just couldn't get it through their heads. That sounds like people, doesn't it? That's the way we are. All right, another theme, and I didn't write this up there, but another theme, and it's kind of related to this, is the idea of prophecy. Now, the main point of the prophetic stories is that God's prophecies sometimes fulfilled, or always fulfilled? Always fulfilled. All right. There are prophecies that have been in place for years and years and years and have yet to be fulfilled, but they're ones that we know, right? What's the prophecy? That Jesus Christ will come. He will come again. He will not come to this earth, but we will be taken up to meet him in the air. And there we will be taken to stand before the throne room of God. God will pronounce judgment. And then from that point on, our fates are sealed. But God's prophecies are always fulfilled, so that any that are not yet fulfilled will be so in the future. Now, we've said before that part of these prophecies that many people believe is that Jesus will come again. He will come to this earth. He will set up an earthly kingdom. It will be in Jerusalem. Israel will be raised back to its status that it once enjoyed for so many years. But we know that that's not the case, because God's prophecies were fulfilled in that particular instance. All right, so we don't need to worry about that. But anything that God said is going to happen has either happened or it will happen in the way that he says it's going to happen. All right, let's go to Kings and 2 Chronicles. All right, the second book of Chronicles covers much the same time period as the books. Okay, sorry, I had a hard time reading that clock. The second book of Chronicles covers much the same time period as the books of Kings, but it ignores the northern kingdom of Israel almost completely. David is given a major role in planning the temple. Hezekiah is given a much more far-reaching program of reform, and Manasseh of Judah is given an opportunity to repent of his sins, apparently to account for his long reign. After he came in repentance, what did he do? He went back and began to reform, turned his back on all of those idols, repented of his sin, and then God allowed him to reign for actually a long period of time. But it wasn't until after he repented of the evil that he done, because what kind of evil did Manasseh do? It says that he did what? In one case, it says that the streets ran red with blood. He was a bloody king. He was a brutal king. He was an idolatrous king. He was a wicked and evil king. But it also goes to show that Manasseh, as bad as he was able to repent. God restored him. It kind of teaches us a lesson today. And of course, we're going to get into that as we talk about Manasseh. All right. The book of Chronicles, Hebrew word Divrei Hayamim, is a book in the Hebrew Bible found as two books in the Christian Old Testament. This is just information that you might want to get. Chronicles is the final book of the Hebrew Bible. All right, so what does that have to tell us? The Chronicles is the final book of the Hebrew Bible. What happens in Chronicles? Do we find out where the temple is supposed to be? Yes, we find out where the temple is going to be as we read through these. Now, let's think about this. What about the Samaritans? How do we understand about the Samaritans? What was the final book for the Samaritans in their Bible? Correct. So the Samaritans did not look at anything after Deuteronomy. So they had no idea where the temple was supposed to be. So what did they do? They found the most holy place that they could find in their Bible, and that's where they worshiped. Remember the Samaritan woman talking to Jesus? She's asking him, where's the correct place to worship? You Jews worship in Jerusalem, where our fathers worshiped on the mountain. But what's correct? He says, I tell you that a time is coming and now is when what? Won't matter. Physical place won't matter. And we're thankful for that, right? We don't have an earthly kingdom set up here. It's a spiritual kingdom. We don't have a holy city somewhere else in the world. Now, a lot of people have a holy city. We don't have a holy city. Christians, New Testament Christians don't have a holy city. We are, right? We are, our physical bodies are the temple. Jesus is our high priest. We don't have to worry about all of that. All right. So we're thankful. This is a better arrangement. All right, we don't have to set out on a pilgrimage 2 or 3 times a year to go and set up for holy days or anything like that. We worship God where we are. Where 2 or more are gathered together in my name, there I will be also. So the 3 of us right here, if it was the first day of the week and we wanted to have a worship service, just the 3 of us, we could have a worship service that would be as good as anything anyone else can do anywhere. I don't know everybody else's singing ability, but we can make a stab at it. But we can do everything that we need to do in order to worship. We're thankful for that. But that's why the Samaritans worship where they worship. You know, they didn't understand, they didn't observe 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So this idea that, well, this is where it's supposed to be, they didn't see that or understand that. All right, it contains a genealogy starting with Adam all the way back to the very beginning and a history of ancient Judah and Israel up to and including the Edict of Cyrus the Great in Persia in 539 BC, where he says, and it's interesting, and we're going to talk about this, but it's interesting to note who told Cyrus who told the people to rebuild the temple? Cyrus did. Who told Cyrus to rebuild the temple? God did. So does God work even in the lives of people who are not his children? Yes, but always with what? Always with the idea of doing what to God? Magnifying and glorifying God. So Cyrus says, anybody that's from there that wants to go back, you're free. As a matter of fact, I'm going to send you back and I'm going to do everything in my power to help you rebuild what you lost. When we think about, this is a man who didn't know God in the sense that he was a child of God, but God spoke to him and he listened. Good idea, right? When God speaks to us, we listen. All right. So up to and including this edict that Cyrus the Great made in 539 BC. Now, the book was divided into 2 books in the Septuagint, translated mid-3rd century BC. In Christian context, Chronicles is referred to in the plural as the Book of Chronicles, after the Latin name, of course, Chronicon, given to the text by Jerome. But in the Hebrew, it's actually the words of the days. The words of the days. You might want to put a little asterisk next to that. The words of the days. All right. Chronicles narrative begins with Adam, Seth, and Enoch, and the story is carried forward almost entirely through genealogical lists. And that's why I think a lot of people don't really delve much into First Chronicles, at least the first 27 chapters of Chronicles, because let's be honest, not many people want to read a list. All right. That's why I do Numbers is not given a whole lot of time and effort in our Bible reading. If you're reading through the Bible in a year, like a lot of people do, a lot of people they get to Numbers and they bog down, and so they either skip a bit or they just give up. I tell you what, we're going to stop right here. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll pick back up again at 7. Okay, all right. Sorry, I saw the time getting away and I didn't do anything about it, but we're going to stop right here, and then we're going to get back into it in just a couple minutes. So we'll see you here in just a few. That's fine. All right, good to get back. We're going to go and get started again. We had finished up before our break with the idea of the narrative of the Chronicles, beginning with Adam, Seth, and Enoch, and it's carried forward through genealogy. And actually, we're going to get into a little bit of that genealogy because we're going to talk about First Chronicles, the one that nobody really wants to talk about because it's just a list of genealogy. Apparently, there's someone here who enjoyed reading and hearing about the genealogies, but most people are just they seem kind of dry. However, if you look at the genealogies the way that you should, the way that you need to, you see God's providence in allowing these things to be recorded. Because remember, one of the problems that a lot of people have is, who is Jesus that we should have taken any notice of him? Well, guess what Jesus can do with his genealogy? Take it all the way back to whom? The person that he needs to, right? Who? Adam. All the way back. Of course, we find that as we go through the synoptic gospels and the book of John. It's the idea that Jesus's genealogy is indisputable. We can take it back exactly where we need to point out he is who he is. But God is great. God's providence is great in that he wants these things recorded. And we're going to see that here in just a couple of moments. All right. The bulk of the remainder of First Chronicles, after, of course, the account of Saul in chapter 10, is concerned with the reign of King David. The next long section concerns David's son Solomon. And the final part is concerned with the kingdom of Judah, with occasional references to the kingdom of Israel. 2 Chronicles 10 through 36. The final chapter even covers very briefly the reigns of the last four kings until Judah is destroyed and is carried away into Babylon. And the final two verses, if you look at the final two verses of 2 Chronicles and look at the opening verses of the book of Ezra. Anybody got that? Can anybody look that up for me? 2 Chronicles, last couple of verses, and then the first couple of verses of the book of Ezra.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout his kingdom and also put it in writing, saying, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up."
Okay. And that's the last part of Chronicles, correct? What's the first 4 or 5 verses of the book of Ezra? What do they say? Sort of a wraparound. Just 1 second. In the first year, Ezra 1, starting in verse 1, it's a wraparound, right? So the last part of the book of 2 Chronicles ties into the first chapter of the book of Ezra. In the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, much in the same way he gave Nebuchadnezzar the kingdoms of the earth, right? God works in the Gentile nations. Israel was of course special to God, but God had a hand in all the things that were going on in the world, much in the same way that he does today. He's given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Now, I want you to think about that for just a second. Look at God's mindset. God did not allow David to build the temple, did he? Why didn't God allow David to build the temple?
Because
he was a man of war.
He was what?
He was a man of war.
He was a man of war. He had shed not just a little bit of bloodshed. David had shed gallons and gallons and gallons of blood necessarily, and at the word of God, but still God says, you are not going to build my temple. I'm going to allow another to do it. It's going to be your son. It is going to be a time of peace and a time of prosperity so that the attention can be given, but you're not going to do it. And as a matter of fact, he has this conversation with David through Nathan. Why I've not asked you to build me a temple. Like, you don't, no one, if I ask to build me a temple, if I want one, I'll ask for it to be built. However, you are going to make preparations for your son to build it after you are gone. All right. But compare and contrast that. God did not allow David to build this temple, but what does God allow him to do? What does God allow Cyrus to do? He does what? He has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. God stirred up Cyrus to do this for him. Was Cyrus a man of blood? Yes. Just goes to show that if we think for 1 second that we can determine what God is going to do and who he's going to use to do it, we are on a fool's errand. God knows what he wants, and he's going to charge exactly the right person for the time, exactly the right way to do it. Yes, ma'am.
God sets up kings and takes them down.
Yes, he does.
There have been some evil, corrupt leaders in the world, still
Yes.
are,
Yes,
but he sets up kings and takes them down for his purposes.
absolutely. As a matter of fact, let's just continue reading because you're exactly correct. He has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. Now you think about this is a man who does not know God in the sense that these exiles know God. But this is a man who is listening to God and is going to do what God tells him to do. Why? Because he's seen the consequences of those who do not do what God tells him to do. And let each survivor in whatever place he sojourns be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold. Man, this sounds so familiar. And with goods and with beasts, besides free will offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Of course, they all rose up, all those who desired to go back. Some people didn't go back. That was not home for them. They remained in the land that they were in. That's why, as far as you could go, you would find synagogues of people who were of Jewish descent and they wanted to worship their God, but they did not go back to Jerusalem. But there were a faithful remnant that did go back. And there was a faithful remnant that engaged in the resurrection of Jerusalem and the resurrection of the temple, and they set their mind to it. And let's see, I want you to go to verse 8, chapter 1 and verse 8 of Ezra. Cyrus, king of Persia, brought these out in the charge of Mithridath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And this was the number of them: 30 basins of gold, 1,000 basins of silver, 29 censers, 30 bowls of gold, 410 bowls of silver, and 1,000 other vessels. All the vessels of gold and of silver were 5,400. All of these did Sheshbazzar bring up when the exiles were brought up from Babylonia to Jerusalem. So not only did he send them back, he sent them back with goods. He sent them back with what was necessary to rebuild this great temple that he had allowed to be destroyed by the king that started all of this, Nebuchadnezzar. All right. So,
Chuck?
Yes.
You think about it, what Cyrus is doing here is exactly what Pharaoh should have done 500 years earlier when he was confronted by Moses.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's interesting that in one case, God allowed the Israelites or the Hebrews at the time, I got to get my nomenclature correct. The Hebrews at the time allowed them to spoil the Egyptians, right? He allowed them to spoil the Egyptians. As they were going out, their neighbors were coming up and pressing gold and silver and costly and all of these goods into their hands. And imagine had Pharaoh simply listened to the word of God and listened to the command of God and allowed the Hebrews to leave when he was told to, how much would God have magnified Pharaoh? He's always going to reward those who do his will. Always. He always has.
He wouldn't have lost his firstborn.
He would. Well, think about the chaos. I mean, if you look at the plagues of Egypt, I think sometimes when you look at the movies, many times it seems like the after effects are over in just a short period of time. God took every single one of the gods of the Egyptians, turned them on the Egyptians, caused chaos and anarchy in the kingdom. And Pharaoh was losing his grip on his kingdom. And the only thing that he knew to do was to lash out in the only way that he knew how. And then not only did he lose his kingdom, not only did he lose his firstborn son, he lost his life. And Egypt was decimated for generations after that. And you're absolutely right. Had he simply done what he was told, but what did Cyrus do? Cyrus heard the word of the Lord, opened up his ears, heard the word of the Lord, and then acted upon it in a righteous manner. So this is a man who, even though he was not an Israelite, was acting more like an Israelite than even the Israelites were acting like. All right. So very good comment. And I agree 100%. How much it would have been it would have been so much better for Pharaoh, and how good it was for Cyrus. All right, let's see. The final chapter covers the reigns of the last four kings. Judah is destroyed. The people are taken to exile in Babylon. In the final two verses, we see where the last words of Chronicles and the first words of Ezra mirror each other. That tells us who was likely the author of Chronicles. Jeremiah is most likely the author of Kings. Who's most likely the author of Chronicles? Ezra. Okay. Commonly accepted, Ezra is the author of both of those books. All right, so Cyrus the Great conquers the Babylonian Empire, authorizes the restoration of the temple in Jerusalem, and he allows them to return with goods to take back and to make that happen. All right, a little bit of the structure of Chronicles, much like Kings. Originally, it was a single work. It was divided into two in the Septuagint. It was a Greek translation produced in the third and second centuries BC. It has three broad divisions. First one had two major divisions. Or I'm sorry. It actually had four. All right, so let's look at this real quick. You have the genealogies. We understand the importance of those genealogies. Learn to spell genealogies. All right, and then the rest of First Chronicles, and then chapters 1 through 9 of Second Chronicles. You have the reigns of David and Solomon. And then you have the remainder of Second Chronicles. You have the divided kingdom. And mainly the focus is, of course, on Judah. All right, so genealogies in chapters 1 through 9 of First Chronicles, the rest of First Chronicles, and then going all the way through chapter 9 of Second Chronicles, you have the reigns of King David. A lot of there's a lot of focus on that because those were the glory days, right? Those were the glory days of Israel. Even Saul was third tier when it came to David and Solomon. David, because of his incredible output of energy. I mean, this is a man who took a kingdom that was together, but it was not united. That's a very important point. The kingdom under Saul was not united, but under David it was. And when he makes his final address to Solomon, or to God, to the people, and his charge to Solomon, you see he refers to that, the idea that he had basically tamed all of these tribes that were kind of like the United States at the very beginning. I don't want to draw too much of a point to that, too much of an analogy, but you look at the original states, and they basically had their own governments. They looked out for their own self-interest, and then you had these states that came together in a confederation and eventually became the United States. Well, it was much the same way in Israel. You had all of these tribes, and there was a lot of. Remember how these tribes came about. Was the home life of when these tribes, you trace all these tribes back to their originators. What was that like? Was that a peaceful, a functional family when these 12 men were all together in the house? Why was that not a peaceful existence for all of those folks? How did they come about? You had two wives, and then you had two handmaidens or concubines, and all of them are having children to spite the other one. That was the purpose behind it. I'm going to have another child because I can, and because she can't. So I'm going to have another one, and I'm going to name it in such a way that's going to mock her. And then I'm going to have another one, and then I'm going to have another one. And now my handmaiden is going to have one, and her handmaiden, because she's desperate now, she's got to have one. I have so many, and she doesn't have any. Now she's going to have one through her handmaiden. And finally, of course, we have the child of promise. But before that, it was an awful thing. So you had these 12 tribes that came from 12 disparate young men, all of them from different wives, which is not the plan of God. If they had just simply been patient, it would have happened the way it was supposed to happen. Well, Jacob kind of brought that on himself, but anyway, so these tribes did all of that familial warfare spill over into the tribes. It had to have, right? It had to have. This tribe didn't like this tribe, and this tribe didn't like this tribe, and these two tribes were united, but they couldn't stand the other one, and it was a terrible thing. So all of these tribes in their various areas within the physical kingdom or the physical land of God, in the land of Israel, they're constantly at odds with one another. Well, what did David do? He came in and united them. Was it always perfect? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But it was far superior to what it was even under the judges and Saul. Saul was making a stab at it, but of course Saul fell flat on his face and blew it as far as in the eyes of God. All right. So you have the reigns of David and Solomon, and then of course you have in the remainder of 2 Chronicles chapter 10 all the way through the end of the book, you have the narrative of the divided kingdoms focusing on the kingdom of Judah. All right. Let's see. 1 Chronicles is divided into 29 chapters, 2 Chronicles into 36 chapters. The last events recorded in Chronicles take place in the reign of Cyrus the Great, as we spoke of earlier. Conquered Babylon in 539, which sets about pretty much the earliest possible date for the writing of the book. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to include that. We know that Ezra is believed to have written both Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah. They identified this author as Ezra, the 5th century BC figure Ezra. I'm reading from stuff I've gathered from all these things that I've read over the past couple of weeks. Let's look at this. I want to look at the themes. This is the sections, but I want to look at the themes because I think these themes are important. Because I think they still hold true, and we have to be careful that we don't forget history. Because as Satiana said, those who forget history are what?
Condemned to repeat it.
Condemned to repeat it. And like how he says that condemned, not entitled to repeat it, they're condemned to repeat it. So we need to be very careful. All right, so number one, these are things you'll probably want to write down. Number one, God is an act of God. Throughout history. All right. God is an active God throughout history, especially the history of Israel. Not only the history of Israel, but the history of his spiritual Israel. The faithfulness of sin or sins of individual kings are immediately rewarded or punished by God. Now, this is in Chronicles, and this is in contrast to the theology that we find in the book of Kings, where the faithlessness or the sin of kings is actually punished throughout the generations, and it continues on. It follows them throughout history, even through the Babylonian exile. All right, number two, God calls Israel to a special relationship. God calls Israel to a special relationship. He called physical Israel to a special relationship. He calls spiritual Israel to a special relationship. Does God care for the Gentile? Absolutely. Of course he does. Does he care for the Jew? Of course he does. Does he care for the Muslim? Of course he does. Does he care for the atheist? Yes. He cares for everybody. But he called the physical Israel to a very special relationship. To no one else did he give the law. To no one else did he send the prophets. He sent them to, he gave that to, well, with a few exceptions, he called Israel to a very special relationship. And the call begins with these, with the genealogies. It goes from the focusing all that from all mankind, right, from the beginning of Adam, and it talks about all of the. If you look through, we're going to look at these genealogies in a minute, and it spreads out. It's this incredible broad array of people that come from Adam, and all of the branches that come off of that family tree from that first man and that first woman. But then all of that focuses on one. And it follows that one all the way through. And it goes all the way through to David. All the way through. He calls them to a very special relationship. Does he call us to a special relationship today? And it's interesting that they go through and you find this focus on David. But that's why it's so important that we have these, because we can trace our king all the way back to the throne of David. Remember, he promised it. The throne's not going to depart from you. So who do we serve? We serve a king. And that king puts us into a very special relationship with God. No one else can do that. No one can come to the Father except through who? The Son. Okay? All right. True Israel, and this is important. As God required true worship from his physical Israel, he requires true worship from his spiritual Israel today. True Israel are those who continue to worship Jehovah in the manner that he prescribes. All right. Number 3. David, God chose David. Remember, God chose David, right? Of his will. God chose David and his family as agents of his will. According to the author of Chronicles, the 3 great events of David's reign were his bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, his founding of an eternal royal dynasty, and his preparations for the construction of the temple. Those were the big 3. Think about all of the other things that he did, the mighty works that David performed. These were the 3 most important things that he did. He set up an area that God would be worshiped. He founded a throne that would never depart from him, never depart from Judah. He prepared the construction of the temple. All right. Number 4. God chose a site where he would be worshiped. God chose a site where he would be worshiped. And more time and space in the books are spent on the construction of the temple and its rituals of worship than any other subject. Number 5, God remains active and involved with Israel, but spiritual Israel. God remains active in Israel, but in the spiritual Israel. If God wanted the kingdom to be rebuilt, if God wanted the temple to be rebuilt, is there anything that we could do to stop him? If God doesn't want it to be built, is there anything that we could do to subvert that decision? No, not at all. What does it say? If it's of God, there's nothing that we can say or do lest we be found fighting against God. But if it's of man, then it's going to come to nothing anyway. So we need to just sit back and be patient, let God do what God does best, which is be God, and make the decisions, make those hard decisions, and enact things that will allow things to happen if they need to, or prevent things that don't need to happen. But God is going to remain active in Israel, but it's going to be his spiritual Israel, which is the church. All right. That's an overview. That's our brief overview. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to get into First Chronicles. So if you want to turn to First Chronicles chapter 1, we're going to trace some steps.
Chuck,
And if you've got,
this is Vern. Question before we go to the next portion.
Yes.
In regards to the author of Chronicles, you mentioned that Ezra was the suggested author, or was it Jeremiah?
Ezra, I'm sorry, Jeremiah is the accepted author for Kings. Ezra is the accepted author for Chronicles.
Thank you.
I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Absolutely. And again, it seems like every time you turn around, there will be a new group of scholars that will say, well, we think that we're looking at this, and they will take something small. And this is where we got to be very careful that we don't get hung up on dating. And I know that sounds counterintuitive. We think, well, it's a history. It's history, and it's written down as historical, but there's a purpose behind it, rather than simply saying this king reigned from this time to this time, and then this king reigned from this time to this time. That's what many people who want to poke holes, that's what they go with. Well, we see here that this date can't possibly work. And we have to be careful that we don't get bogged down in that idea. And that's what a lot of people will go with. Well, we have reason to believe that this date was not quite what we thought it was. And this throws doubt on the authorship of whatever book it might be, whether it's Chronicles or Ezra or Kings or any of those. We don't, that's why I've said from the very beginning, I'm not going to get involved in the dating process in regards to this book, because it's too easy for people to try to attack it. There's no reason behind it. We look at the book for the purpose that it was written, and that is to give us a rather sweeping history of the nation of Israel, and in certain instances, or in the nation of Judah, and in certain instances, the nation of Israel, with the purpose of understanding what God's thought process was behind how things happened and how he allowed them to happen, how he caused them to happen. All right.
Okay.
All right, so let's look at, absolutely. First Chronicles chapter 1 starts with who? Starts with who? Adam. Who else would you start with, right? So he goes from Adam, and I'm not going to read all of these names. For one, you get tongue-tied trying to get some of these names out. But let's look at this. From Adam, Seth, and it's very interesting. He doesn't really give a lot of background behind him. That every once in a while he'll put a little small thing in here, a little bit of information, extra information, but by and large, he recites names. This is kind of a secondary thing, where the Jews, what was the importance of the genealogies to the Jews? Why were the genealogies important to the Jews?
It was their proof that they were Jews.
Exactly. It was almost like an ID. Because when these things, that's one of the reasons, that's one of the purposes of the temple, wasn't it? What happened at the temple? What was held at the temple?
The Ark of the Covenant.
In regards to the genealogies is what I'm talking about, though. What about the genealogies was what part did the temple play in the genealogies? There was a record kept, right? When a child was born, they would take them to the temple. They would offer the sacrifice. But then what did they do? They entered his name or her name. Why? Why was that important?
But later they were criticized for trusting those into genealogy.
And I think that's, well, I know that's one of the reasons that the Lord saw fit to destroy the temple, is to get rid of the genealogies, get rid of those records. One of the reasons was it was a way that you could prove that you were truly an Israelite. You're really a Jew. Why? Because I can trace my family back. I can go to the temple and I can find, yep, there's my dad, there's his dad, there's his dad, there's his dad, there's his dad. And they could go back as far as they needed to go. Part of it was the idea of how was Israel divided up? By who? The tribes. And when you were trying to find your little piece of the pie, what did you have to do? You had to prove what tribe you were with. What about marriages? All of this was important to them. And keeping those genealogies was absolutely essential. And there were huge rooms at the temple that were specifically dedicated and devoted to keeping these records, so that if there's ever an issue, that we could go back and we can look and we can find, we can 100% confirm. It's confirmation type of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Just to add, I guess that found its ultimate purpose in Christ and leading up to his
Absolutely.
and what more you said really down.
And you could, and that was the great thing, and that was one of the I don't want to use the word selling point, but it was definitely a selling point when the Jews were approached about the Christ. They knew certain things about him, and one of them was, who is he? Where does he come from? Remember that was a question they asked all the time. Where are you from? Well, we know his father, we know his family. They're all here. We know exactly how he goes, how we can trace him as far back as we need to know. But then once they confirmed who Jesus was, that he was from the lineage that he was supposed to be from, the genealogy didn't mean anything anymore. All of that led to this. All of this leads to what we have now. There's no need for it anymore because it doesn't matter. I don't know how far back. That's why they have places like Ancestry.com. I can go so far back with my family, but then it just tails off into, well, we think this and we're pretty sure this. But the Jews weren't taking any chances. If a child was born, even if the child didn't survive, the child's name was written down. Everything was recorded, and it was purposeful. And so we see the author here very purposeful. He goes back and he's got names. And how did he get these names? He had to have been literate, had to have been fairly knowledgeable, and had access to all of this. All right. So he says this. Yes.
You think about it too, when you get to Matthew 1, that shows the value of that, because when Matthew is writing to the Jews there, showing the lineage of Jesus, he can track himself, because they said, are you even part of Abraham? And he could track his heritage all the way back to Abraham from Matthew 1.
Yes. And nobody had a more admirable lineage. And see, was that, again, I hate to use the word selling point, but was that a selling point to the Jews? Jesus could trace his lineage back to whom? The king, the greatest king that the Jews had ever had, David. He could take his lineage all the way back there and even go even farther back. But this was a point of, I don't want to use the word pride, but it was a point of confirmation. I mean, there is no doubt in their mind. Well, how do we know that? Well, because we can go to the temple and we can look it up. We can go as far back as we need to go. Yes, sir.
You think about it too, that shows the misconception that Philip had when he said, can anything good come out of Nazareth?
At least one good thing came out of Nazareth, didn't it? At least one good thing came out of Nazareth. But it's interesting. I don't know if anybody here watches the show, The Chosen. I enjoy it. I think it's an enjoyable show. But it's kind of a running joke throughout the show. I say joke, but it's a common point where people they get a chuckle out of folks because they keep saying, where is he from? And they say Nazareth. And of course, as soon as they say that, they'll either say something or their face just drops because they realize, why is that? That's not a point of pride that you came out of Nazareth. I mean, nothing good comes out of Nazareth. And I always found that to be a kind of that's an interesting point throughout the series. But yes, it is. And again, this idea of using this to confirm who Jesus was and what his lineage was of paramount importance. It had to be, because they knew that it could, even the Messiah would come from what tribe? Which tribe? Judah. Why? Because the scepter would not depart from Judah. So what did they have to do? They had to show that Jesus could trace his lineage back to Judah. And once you had that, then the rest of it falls into place. But once that was no longer necessary, all those records are gone with the wind. There's and this kind of throws a monkey wrench in anybody that wants to reestablish the temple. Who's going to serve? Who's going to serve? Who's going to serve at the temple? Well, I can. Are you a Levite? I think I can. I don't know if I can or not. If you're not a Levite, you're not allowed to serve. That's not your. You don't have that. You don't have that right to do that. How are you going to find it? You're not. So God knew what he was doing. When he eliminated the temple, he really washed the last important vestiges of Judaism away. Even though they're still today, they call themselves Jews. How can they be? How can you be? All right. All right. So let's look at this for just a couple of minutes. And we'll look at some interesting points. Of course, we start at the very beginning, Adam, Seth, Enoch, and it begins to get into names that we just don't know. Nobody studied these, except in the process of getting to the end point, which is what we're wanting to do. But he does point out the very beginning. He says, Adam, Seth, and he goes all the way through to who? Right before the flood, we got Noah. And then, of course, we know that after the flood, there were only 4 men of adult age there. There was Noah, there was Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Then he goes into the sons of Japheth. Because what does he say about Japheth in Genesis chapter 12? It's Genesis chapter 12. I tell you what, I'm not going to think about it. I'm going to find it. It's always a good idea. Oh, sorry. No, Genesis 9. Yes, sorry. Genesis chapter 9, verse 12. All right. No, I'm sorry. Not chapter 12. Chapter 9, verse 24. I'll get it right in a minute. I promise. Genesis 9, verse 24. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." Interesting. He says, "Cursed be Canaan." Why Canaan? Well, we'll see here in just a couple moments. He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of" who? Shem. And let who be his servant? Okay, why Canaan and not Ham? What's going to happen? It's exactly right. It's exactly right. Ham is the father of the nations of Canaan, who did what in the sight of the Lord? Evil or good? Horrible evil. Evil that I mean, today, if we've caught people doing what they were doing, the acts what they call worship to their gods, the things that they were doing, we would round them up and put them under the jail. These are the things that they were doing. Horrific things. Child sacrifice, sexual sin that is just appalling. Even today, as wicked as we think this world is. You had something you were going to say, ma'am, and I did not.
A footnote here on 1 verse 2 says the Hebrew for Canaan is Quenan.
Huh. Interesting. Quenon.
Quenan.
Canaan. Okay. So he says, he also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth." What happens to Japheth? Let him dwell in the tents of Shem. He was basically going to always live in the shadow, but under the auspices and the protection of his brother. And let Canaan be his servant. Now let's look at verse 18. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. All right. So Ham was going to father those who would go on to live in the land of Canaan that God was going to give to Israel. And what was going to happen eventually? What was Israel going to do? Israel was going to come in and displace these people, and those who were left, what did they do for Israel? They did all of the stuff that nobody wanted to do. They were the hewers of wood. They were the carriers of water. The things that would make them ritualistically unclean or impure, they did. They were dung carriers. They manned the latrines, so to speak. Every city had a place where you would take refuse, human refuse, and other things. Those were the people who did all of that. So we see even now Noah's curse against Ham coming to pass later on. All those nations of Canaan that were not destroyed ended up serving the families, the descendants of the brothers that did not act reprehensibly against their father. All right. So an important distinction to make. I mean, from the very beginning, we see where this is, the Chronicles take a sharp turn very quickly. The sons of Japheth, and it goes into all of these sons. The sons of Ham, look at these: Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. And then it goes on to talk about all of these descendants. Let's see. Canaan fathered Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites. Do these sound familiar? When Israel starts marching up to Canaan, these are the people. Hey, when you come into these people, you destroy all of them. When you come into the contact with these people, you destroy the men. You leave the women and the children. And in these situations, you kill everything. Men, women, children, animals, it doesn't matter. You destroy all of them. Guess it depends on how bad their sin was, what God saw fit and proper. So the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Arkites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, and the Hamathites. So he goes into all of these families that are going to eventually make up a portion of what we find when God delivers the nation of Israel into Canaan. All right. He continues on. Sons of Shem. It focuses on one. To Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg. And for in his days, the earth was divided. Now, many scholars seem to think that this is the point where the earth, the flood occurred and the earth was broken up. This is widely held to be a popular theory, that while before all of this, the earth was, of course, one great landmass. And after the flood, the earth was broken up by the waters that came forth and divided up into the continents. There's some certainly, in my opinion, some validity to that idea. But in his days, the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. It continues on, and all of these were the sons of Joktan: Shem, Arpachshad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor, Terah, and who? Verse 27. Abram. That is who? Abraham. So we've already established a clear line all the way from Adam all the way to Abraham. It cannot be disputed. All of these names are known, and now they are written down so that they can go back and they can trace the family units all the way back, all the way up. All right, in verse 28, I tell you what, let's stop here. We're back to let's take us another break, 10-minute break, and we'll get back into it at 8 o'clock. That sound good to everybody? All right. Okay, we are back, and we are in 1 Chronicles chapter 1, and we've established a direct line from Adam all the way to Abraham, so there can be no doubt. And then from that point on, verse 28, the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael, and it talks about the genealogies, the firstborn of Ishmael, and it goes into the account of Ishmael. Here's the thing: does the genealogy of Ishmael matter in the sense that we're talking about it tonight? Ishmael's genealogy is not terribly important. It was for them, obviously, because it determines, who's the firstborn, who receives inheritance, and all of these things. But for the purposes that we're looking at it, the genealogy, that doesn't matter. However, the chronicler puts this down so that it can be used if that's necessary. But we're not concerned with Ishmael as far as we're concerned. Because remember, how many children of promise were there to be? There was going to be one child of promise. Was Ishmael that child of promise? No. Why was Ishmael even born?
Sarah got impatient.
Sarah wanted the baby. And it goes to show that there are things that are consistent in human nature from as far back as you can go. It is in the physical nature of human beings, but especially women, to want a child. And we deny that to our detriment if we're not very careful. But from the very beginning, it was something, it cemented a family, it cemented a place in the household, it established things. We could go into the whole socioeconomic aspect of boys versus girls and all of that that's going on, but that's not really why we're here. But Sarah wanted a child. She wanted a child. So what did she do? She gave who to her husband? Hagar. She says, go into my handmaiden and father a child. And that way I'll have a child. But the thing about it is, it was her handmaiden, but was that really her child? It really wasn't. It did.
But then when Hagar started to lord it over her, she realized she made a big mistake.
That's kind of a hint of things to come, isn't it? And you think that this was not too far down the family tree. You would think that Jacob would say, you know what? I heard some really terrible things about granddad and all the issues that he's had. Maybe this is not a good idea, but what does he do? He falls right into it. And that goes that while you may have manipulative women, you have weak men who are led into it. Now, see, Jacob said, "Look, I'm not getting involved in this. I'm not going to do this." But what did he do? He got right back into it. You were going to say something?
When we try to help God, it doesn't end well.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. And these are not small things. These were events that were troublesome for many generations to come. I mean, we see how the tribes were, and most of that can be traced back to, well, your great grandfather did this to my great grandfather, and we remember the stories and we remember how things, and a lot of that is lost in antiquity, but we remember what happened. No, you don't. But that's not going to keep people from behaving badly towards one another. All right. But in the case, what we're talking about here, we're talking about the child of promise, which is Isaac. And it talks about the firstborn of the genealogy of Israel, of Ishmael, but we're not concerned about that. In verse 34, chapter 1 of verse 34, we see where Abraham fathered Isaac, the one son of promise, the son through which Abraham was going to be what? What did God promise him? I'm going to make of you a what? A father of many people, great nations. And it's exactly what he did. But it had to come through the one that God determined. It's interesting, though, that God did not turn his back on Ishmael. Ishmael had nothing to do with this. And God looks at the innocent and he says, I'm not going to hold this against this child. So what does God promise Hagar? I'm going to make Ishmael he's going to be great. Trust me. He may not be the one that I promised Abraham and Sarah, but he is going to be a father of great nations, and he did. You go back and you look at the family that came through that, and they were absolutely, it was a great nation. All right. So the sons of Isaac, Esau and Israel, or Jacob and Esau. Of course, we're talking about Israel. All right. Again, didn't follow the plan. All right. So we've got Esau and Israel. It's very interesting. We're not going to go too much into the story, but who was born first? Yeah. Esau. Esau was born first. Yeah, no. As soon as you said it, I was like, I know he means Esau. Yeah, Esau was born first. So as the firstborn child, was he not the one that would be the inheritor of the things that Jacob had? That double portion, and then the blessing that came to the firstborn. But Jacob's name he was not named in vain, right? He is a supplanter. So what does he do? Well, through the machinations again of his mother, he ends up stealing his brother's, not all of his brother's inheritance, but he steals that double portion. It comes to him. And he receives the blessing that should have gone to his other brother. So anyway, we end up with what we've got, and there it is. And that's why God changes his name from Jacob to Israel. All right, continuing on, the sons of Esau, and he goes through all of these sons, but again, these are not the sons that we're concerned with. This is not the lineage that we're concerned with. Let's go to, let's see, chapter 2. All right, all of the rest of chapter 1 is the genealogy of Esau, but that's not what we're concerned with. Let's go to chapter 2. These are the sons of Israel. Of course, we've got them: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Joseph, Benjamin, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The sons of Judah, Onan, and Shelah. These 3, and you go into all of these. But at the end of the day, we're still concerned with one lineage, right? We're trying to get to who? We're not trying to get to Jesus, but we're trying to get to who? David, all right? Because that's the lineage that the kingdom has come from. Why are we not concerned with Saul? What tribe was Saul? Saul was the tribe of Benjamin. Saul was a Benjaminite, but that's not who was going to receive the scepter. It was going to be Judah when God brought David to the throne. It wasn't going to depart from there. All right, so he goes all 3 of these, and then let's go to verse 4. His daughter-in-law, Tamar, also bore him Perez and Zerah. Verse 5, the sons of Perez, Hezron and Hamel. It goes all the way through, but we're concerned with Hezron. Verse 9, the sons of Hezron that were born to him, and he goes through all of these. It gets down to verse 11. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse fathered Eliab, his firstborn, Abinadab, Shimeah, Nathanael, Redai, Ozam, and the 7th son is the one we're concerned with, right? Who's the 7th son? Verse 15. David. All right. So now we have established lineage all the way back from David, all the way back to Adam, all with the intent of making sure that we know who was, how all of this came about. And as from David forward, as the genealogies of Matthew, we can trace Jesus all the way back to David. So that's the whole purpose behind all of this. But he continues on. I mean, he goes through all of these names. But we're going to stop basically right here with this, because we were trying to establish David as David's lineage all the way back to Adam. Let's go to chapter 3. Let's go to chapter 3. Again, we're trying to establish genealogy. These are the sons of David who were born to him in Hebron. The first Amnon, the second Daniel, the third Absalom. We know about Absalom, right? What was the problem with Absalom? He should have been named Supplanter, shouldn't he? He would have been a good Jacob. He decided he wanted his father's throne. Not the only son to want David's throne, but he's the first one that made efforts to take David's throne away from him. Not inherit it after his death, as in Adonijah, but as in take over while he basically fomented a coup. He was going to supplant his father while his father was yet still alive. Now, here's the problem. David was anointed by God. What would have been the end result? The end result of Absalom was the only end result that could have occurred, because he sought to stretch out his hand towards God's anointed. Remember, David would even touch Saul while he was alive. He said, that's God's anointed. I'm not going to touch him.
He didn't end well. Absalom didn't end well either.
No, he did not. But again, it was the only possible outcome. David was not going to be removed from the throne, not by anybody other than God. So the only thing that happened to Absalom was the only thing that could have happened to Absalom. He was going to die. All right. So continuing on, the fourth Adonijah, and we'll read about Adonijah here just not too long. He is the one that sought to take the throne away from Solomon after his father's death. The fifth, Shephatiah. I don't know all of these names, and I'm going to struggle with them a little bit. The sixth, Ithream. 6 were born to him in Hebron, where he reigned for 7 years and 6 months, and he reigned 33 years in Jerusalem. So his essentially David's city was Hebron for 6 years or 7 years, and 33 years Jerusalem was the city of David. These were born to him in Jerusalem: Shemiah, Shobab, Nathan, and Solomon. That's the one. That's the lineage that we've got to stick with. The rest of them were not going to take the throne. Only Solomon was going to be promised the throne, and then of course the throne was going to be delivered to him, and God was going to secure that. It wasn't even just David. God was going to secure that throne for Solomon. Then let's go to verse 10. The son of Solomon was Rehoboam, Abijah his son, Asa his son, Jehoshaphat his son, Joram his son, Ahaziah his son, Joash his son, Amaziah his son, and continues on. Why did Solomon have so many sons? Didn't have much of a choice, did he? How many wives and how many concubines did he have? I mean, you're inevitably going to have sons and daughters from these women. Now, truth be told, and I agree with this, I believe that the vast majority of those wives and concubines they did not have relations. That was a political marriage. It bound him to princes and kings in other places. And it was a marriage of convenience and politic. Yeah, essentially. So the one important one here is the son of Solomon was Rehoboam. That's the one that we're going to continue on, because Rehoboam was going to continue to be the king of what? Lower kingdom, Judah. And then the northern kingdom, of course, Jeroboam was going to go up to that northern kingdom and steal away all but two of the tribes to himself. All right. Again, you can read all the way through chapter 3, but if you really want to, it's interesting to look at. But at the end of the day, that's not really what we're going to be concentrating on here. So let's go to chapter 4, the descendants of Judah. Hold on a second. Let me find this. I'll tell you what. Let's not. I'm going to come back to this, but right now we're not going to need to do it. This is essentially talking about the descendants of the 12 tribes, but we know how we're tracing what we need to trace through the descendants of Judah. So we're not going to necessarily need to go through all of these. But in chapter 4, the descendants of Judah, the descendants of Simeon, the descendants of chapter 5, the descendants of Reuben, the descendants of Gad, the half tribe of Manasseh, the descendants of Levi. The Levitical priesthood the Levitical tribe was an important one, right? Because it was only through the Levitical tribe that you were allowed to serve as a priest. So the tribe of Levi was an especially important one to maintain its integrity. Even by accident, you did not want to find yourself as a priest of God if you were not entitled to that title of priest of God. So it's a very important one. It's interesting, of course, that the tribe of Levi, while it was important, and care had to be taken as far as genealogy, they had no place themselves. They had no part of land. They were dispersed throughout the entire nation. Why? What was their purpose? What was the purpose of the Levitical priesthood in the nation?
Serve God. To
serve God. To take part in worship. Worship proper in Jerusalem, in front of the tabernacle, and later on in front of the temple. They would be given a term of service where they would go. It was also through the Levitical priesthood that who would come, and I'm not talking about Jesus, but what important person of Israel would come through the Levites, the high priest, right? So it was an extremely important group of people, even though they did not have their own land to call themselves. But that was their job. They not only served God by leading in worship, but they also instructed the people. The Levites were responsible for knowing what? The law. And what did they do? They instructed them in the law.
They would go on the people's behalf to God.
Absolutely. If somebody would come to them, and they would come to them with concerns or issues or questions, what do I do? My brother has done this, or my family is, and they acted as essentially pastors for the nation of Israel. That was their job, and they took it very seriously, and they needed to take it very seriously. It's kind of an interesting thing when we're told that we are going to be a peculiar nation, a royal what? Priesthood. Do we take our priesthood as seriously as the Levites took their priesthood? Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we fall down. We mess up. We make mistakes. We don't take it as seriously. If the Levitical priesthood was responsible for knowing the law, then as royal priests of God today, what should be the most important thing in our lives? We know the Word of God. We better know the Scriptures. We cannot begin to advise or instruct or teach if we don't know what we're doing. Doesn't mean everybody's going to listen. Doesn't mean everybody's going to stand up and do a 3-hour class on Tuesday evenings. But we better know the Word of God if we're going to claim to be a royal priesthood.
At one time, we had that reputation when I was a youngster. If certain denominations denominational groups stop on the mother's door.
Mhm,
They would ask her where she went to church.
mhm.
As soon as she said the Church of Christ, they shut the Bibles.
They weren't going to get anywhere with her. They weren't going to convince her of something that was not true. And I know that to be the case. It was well established many years ago that the Lord's Church was the repository for biblical knowledge. And if you really wanted to know the truth about something, you'd ask a member of the Lord's Church. We were advisors to governors, and we were advisors to people wanted to know, they want to know Bible. I can't remember who it was that said that, but and it may be one of those apocryphal stories that's not actual true, but it was a case where there was in the courtroom, and they couldn't find a Bible, and they said, we just need to find a member of the Church of Christ, and they said that's as good as putting your hand on the Bible. I believe that. I believe that to be true. I think that we can be that repository of knowledge, but we have to keep ourselves in the Word, like the priest did. Here it is. You dwell on it daily. You teach it to your children when you rise up, when you walk down the path, when you lay your head on the pillow at night. You immerse yourself in God's Word, and that's exactly what we need to be doing. All right. So anyway, it talks about the Levites, but then let's go to verse 48 of chapter 6, 1 Chronicles 6, verse 48. And their brothers, the Levites, were appointed for all the service of the tabernacle of the house of God. If you were not a Levite, you were not entitled to serve in that capacity. No ifs, ands, or buts. There was no excuses. But Aaron and his sons made offerings on the altar of burnt offering and on the altar of incense for all the work of the most holy place, and to make atonement for Israel according to all that Moses, the servant of God, had commanded. Why Aaron and his sons? Because Aaron was what? He was the high priest, and only from the family of Aaron could the high priest be found. That was, again, something that was absolutely essential, and that was one of the problems with the nation of Israel as they began to deteriorate. The priesthood became corrupted. People were serving as priests that were not entitled to serve as priests. There were people who were high priests that were not entitled to serve as high priests. And that's why the promise that we find in Hebrews that we have a high priest that has never sinned makes it even more important. Because this is a man, look what it says. It says to make atonement for Israel. How could they do that if they were not entitled to serve in that capacity? Did God look upon their worship? No. He did not regard their worship for anything. But because we have a high priest that has been tempted in all ways such as man, yet was found blameless, when we worship through him, is our worship accepted? Absolutely, 100%. All right. These are the sons of Aaron. It goes into Eleazar, Phinehas, Abishua, Buki, Uzi, Zerahiah, Marioth, Amariah, Ahitub, Zadok, Ahimaaz. I probably didn't say but 4 of those correctly, but that's the way that it is. These are their dwelling places according to their settlements within their borders. And it gave it again. This is another reason why the genealogies were important, because this is how land was allotted. If you were of this tribe, if you were of this family, this is where your land was. And he goes through all of these sons of Aaron. He gives the cities of refuge with its pasture lands and all of these, essential things to being a member of the family of Abraham. All right. Chapter 7, the descendants of Issachar and the descendants of Benjamin and the descendants of Naphtali and the descendants of Manasseh. Who was Manasseh and Ephraim? Who was Manasseh and Ephraim? They weren't part of the 12. They weren't any of the 12 sons.
They were Joseph's son.
There was the sons of Joseph, right? It means that God even took care of Joseph even when he was in the land of Egypt. It says, you still have a portion of this land. You were promised it as a descendant of Abraham. It's going to come to you. But remember, Joseph did not die, or Joseph died in the land of Egypt. But so what did it go to? That's why is genealogy important in this case? Yeah. How would we determine who to allot land to unless we knew who the sons were? So absolutely. So Joseph got a portion, but it was after he died. And they took, remember, it says they took his bones with them as they departed Egypt. All right. Descendants of Ephraim, descendants of Asher. And then we get to chapter 8. All right. Because remember, all of it's just leading up to this portion. But remember, Saul was a Benjaminite. So let's look at chapter 8 and verse 1. Benjamin fathered Bela, And again, they're going to go through a genealogy, a steady list of names, all bringing up to who? Saul. That's the whole point, is getting it to Saul. Verse 33, Ner was the father of Kish. Kish was the father of Saul. Saul was the father of Jonathan. And then it continues to go on. But remember, after Jonathan, was there anything left of the royal dynasty after Saul? Now the tribe of Benjamin. It went to Judah, and from Judah it would never depart. So Saul was the first and only king that came from the tribe of Benjamin. Even Jonathan, because Jonathan died with his father in battle. All right, chapter 9, a genealogy of the returned exiles. Now, again, we're not going to go through all of these, but these are the people who returned from exile. Exile from where? Verse 1, and Judah was taken to exile into Babylon because of their breach of faith. So this is a genealogy of everyone who returned, everyone who would, because remember, Cyrus said, if you want to go back, you can go back, and I'll send you with everything you need to go back. But not everybody did. But this is a genealogy of the returned exiles. And we're not going to go into all of these right now. But it's important to look at this in chapter 14 of the Levites. That's important, right? It would be no good to rebuild a temple if there weren't people who were authorized to serve in the temple. So there is a genealogy of the Levites as they come back. So what is this important? Yeah. So all of a sudden this temple is being rebuilt. Now we go, okay, we need somebody that's going to do this. Well, who can do it? Well, I know how. Here, these are the names of the people that came back. They're of the tribe of Levites. So we can pull from these names. Let's impress them into the service that they've been called to do. All right. Didn't mean that every Levite had to be a priest, but a priest could only be a Levite. All right. But look at look what they talk about in verse 17. The gatekeepers, those who were in charge of the gates of the house of the Lord, keepers of the threshold of the tent, the work of the service, the keepers of the entrance. Verse 26, for the 4 chief gatekeepers who were Levites were entrusted to be over the chambers and the treasures of the house of God. And they lodged around the house of God, for on them lay the duty of watching, and they had charge of opening it every morning. Verse 28, some of them had charge of the utensils of service, for they were required to count them when they were brought in and taken out. Others of them were appointed over the furniture and over the utensils and over the fine flour and the wine and the oil and the incense and the spices. Others of the sons of the priest prepared the mixing of the spices. In verse 31, and Mattathiah, one of the Levites, was entrusted with making the flat cakes. And also some of their kinsmen of the Kohathites had charge of the showbread to prepare it every Sabbath. Now these, the singers, the heads of the fathers of the houses of the Levites, were in the chambers of the temple, free from other service, for they were on duty day and night. It would be an interesting paper if somebody wanted to write about the authorization of musical instruments and singing in the house of the Lord versus the instruments and singing that we find in the denominational world today, if you're interested in a potential paper. These were the heads of fathers' houses of Levites, according to their generations leaders. These lived in Jerusalem. All right, so then it goes into Saul's genealogy again in verse 10, chapter 10. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Melchishua, the sons of Saul. You think about how sad this is, how we know what kind of a person that Jonathan was, and the fact that Jonathan protected David from his father. And he says he loved David like he was his own, and they said their souls were knitted together. Now, in recent years, you've seen people take that very beautiful relationship between men and turn it into something very ugly and repugnant before God. But we as Christians know what this means. These are 2 people. Jonathan was an older fellow. David was a younger guy, but he saw something in them, and they were friends beyond friends. And this is an important thing. But think about how much better it would have been had Jonathan simply left something that he knew to be wrong and cling to that which was good. Would David have received Jonathan? Had Jonathan gone over to David when Saul was seeking his life? Think about what would happen had Jonathan simply said, I can't do this with my father anymore. What he's doing is sinful. What he's doing is a terrible thing before God. And I'm going to go over to David because I know that David is God's anointed. But Jonathan was loyal to a father who had departed from righteousness and was working iniquity. And what did it cost him? What did it cost him? It cost him his life. And you imagine what David would have done for Jonathan had he remained faithful to David. Once Saul was dead, Jonathan would have been second in command in the kingdom. But he saw fit to stay loyal to his father, and unfortunately, it killed him. Verse 3, the battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was wounded by the archers. And Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and mistreat me. Well, Saul would know about that, wouldn't he? It would be a terrible thing. Saul had killed a lot of Philistines. And if they had caught him while he was alive, it would have been a horrible thing. He would have wished he was dead. So what did he do? Death is preferable to be taken alive by the Philistines. But the armor bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Why did he fear? What would happen to him if he killed Saul? Well, what happened to the person who claimed to have killed Saul? What did David do to him? Killed him. He said, "You dare stretch out your hand against God's anointed?" So he had the man killed. He wasn't even the right guy. But he says, "I don't want to kill. I'm not going to kill Saul. What if this gets back and it's misconstrued?" So he said he wouldn't do it. For he feared greatly. Therefore, Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. The ethical considerations about suicide notwithstanding, you can understand why Saul would want to die by his own hand as opposed to being taken alive by the Philistines. And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died. Thus Saul died, he and his 3 sons and all his house died together. Did God say he was going to take Saul out of the kingdom? He was going to remove him. That the throne he would be removed from the throne would be removed from the house of Saul. Not only did he do that, he took out Saul and his family altogether. It's kind of like Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh didn't survive. His family didn't survive. Nothing survived. And now we see this repeated again. Why? Because of sin. That's all it was. And when all the men of Israel who were in the valley saw that the army had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled, and the Philistines came and lived in them. Think about that's just a horrible thing. That's a repugnant thing. Here's God giving Israel this land to dwell in. And now they came in and took houses that were not theirs, and they lived in these houses. But now, because of the sin of the kingdom and the sin of the king, now the Philistines have done exactly what the Israelites did. They've come and they've driven them out, and now they're living in their houses. You can imagine how that would eat at you. You're running away and you're seeing these people come in and take your house, take everything that you've worked for, all the vineyards, all the livestock, everything like that. And now it'd be like coming home and finding a squatter in your home. Like, you're not supposed to be here. Well, it's mine now. And you hear them in there and they're eating your food and they're sleeping in your bed and they're, taking a bath in your bath. It would just be a repugnant thing. And that's exactly what's happened. It's even worse though, because we bought our house. God gave the Israelites this land, and they've allowed it to slip through their hands because of the sin of their leaders. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his sons fallen on Mount Gilboa, and they stripped him and took his head and his armor and sent messengers throughout the land of Philistines to carry the good news to who? I want you to read that, verse 9. And they stripped him and took his head and his armor and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to who? Who's got
The
it?
temple of their idols.
Their idols. Their idols. These, as David called them, these uncircumcised Philistines are gloating and mocking and cheering on. Why? Because their idols have delivered Saul and his sons to them to be spoiled. I'm sorry, how many years has this been removed from us? And it still rankles me. I'm still aggravated. I'm still angry at it. It just makes me mad because they honestly believed that their idols had delivered Saul. What delivered Saul into their hands? It wasn't the actions of their idols. It was the what? It was the removal of protection by God himself. If God had wanted Saul to win, Saul would have won. Saul would have survived. He would have destroyed all of them. Yeah.
Just wanted to let you know, I hate to slow your roll. And if you want to keep going, that's fine. The class was supposed to.
Oh, I wasn't sure where we were going. I was like, oh, I think I'm correct in this. Okay, you're correct. I'm sorry, guys. It is time to stop. And we're going to stop right here. Saul has been defeated. He has been beheaded. And we're going to read next week. We'll get into this a little bit more next week. If you got any questions, make sure you drop them and I will answer those. And I apologize. We did go over. I'm a preacher. So you get going and it's like, oh man, I'm glad you said something. So let's close with a prayer and then we will be dismissed. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for the day. We're thankful, Lord, for the time that we spent in your word this evening. We pray, Lord, that you bless us in our study, that we can come to know you better, that we can be better servants of yours. Bless each one who is participating. Lord, help them do the very best of their ability. Be with us as we leave this place. Keep us safe as we travel. In Jesus' name, amen.
That it?